In Ireland?
I was born in Ireland, born in Belfast, and where my father was the rabbi of the Jewish community there. And we moved to Dublin when my father became Chief Rabbi of Ireland when I was 9 months old. So I can't say that I recollect very much of life in Belfast at that time.
But what about life growing up in Dublin?
Well, growing up in Dublin, I grew up as not only as part of the Jewish community, but as also the son of one who was, to a degree, involved in the national struggle in Ireland. My father was the sort of individual to whom people turned, regardless of race or creed, and he is remembered to this day. Our family name is still widely recalled and remembered in what was then the Free State era. And I was witness to this fact when I paid a state visit to Ireland in June 1985, if I'm not mistaken it was at that time, when the memories of my late father kept coming forward, being brought forward by all sorts of politicians on both sides in Ireland.
So when you were growing up in Dublin, I mean, did you feel part of Irish society, or were you rather guided by that prayer that every Jewish child learns, next year in Jerusalem?
No, I saw myself as a part of Ireland. I went to a school in Dublin, Wesley College, and was active in student activities and played rugby and so forth. But of course I was brought up by my late father with the aim in life of finally settling in what was then Palestine, hopefully to be a Jewish state in due course. In addition to the vernacular, I spoke Hebrew at home, and in fact I believe I could read and write Hebrew before I could read and write English in Ireland.
When you eventually got to Jerusalem, to Palestine, as it then was, and it was a very difficult time in Jewish history. There were many pressures against the formation of a Jewish state.
No, it was long before the war. It was I came as a small boy in 1935, when my father was appointed Chief Rabbi of Palestine, as it was then. He was later the first Chief Rabbi of Israel. And that was at the time of comparative prosperity here, with a large Jewish immigration coming in from Germany in the mid-30s. A year later, I was to find myself already in the troubles here. I'd grown up in the atmosphere and against the background of the troubles in Ireland, and was only too aware of everything that had happened in Ireland. It was part of our whole makeup, as it were. But I came here, and the Arab Revolt broke out in 1936, and as a young boy I was already a runner and already trained to use a rifle, and was actually a year or two later directly involved in the actions in the Haganah, the Jewish underground, which was of course a part-time occupation at the time.
Did you at any stage see yourself as a terrorist?
On no account. Why should I be a terrorist? All we did was defend ourselves against people who tried to kill us, and you can hardly call that terrorism.
But in that post-war period, that period running up to the War of Independence, I think you'd agree that many Jewish organizations were perceived of by the British, who had the mandate in Palestine, as being precisely that, terrorists.
No, I think you're getting the wrong end of the stick here. Here you had an underground, you had one or two undergrounds fighting against the British forces. They did not fight against any civilians. They did not attack any unarmed people. They fought against the British forces at the time, each in a different way. But as I say, in the final analysis, they fought them. They had nothing against the British people. People try to compare us with the PLO today. The PLO calls in its in the Palestine Covenant, which binds it, for the destruction of the State of Israel and the people of Israel. Pure and simple. In 3 different paragraphs in that convention, and that they're unwilling to change in any way, despite all the statements made by Arafat. We had nothing against the British people. We had nothing against the British civilians. And the same with the Arabs. We fought to defend ourselves. Our war at that time was a purely defensive war.
When that War of Independence finally came in 1948, did you see it as inevitable? And did you see it in a sense as the war that would end all wars? Or did you perhaps presume there would be other wars like 67, 73?
No, I didn't foresee that. You're talking about the War of Independence today as part of history. At that time, I don't know if we thought of it as part of history. We were, as I say, an underground that emerged into being an army. We were the nearest to the ragtag army that the Americans had in their War of Independence. Valley Forge really represented what we were as well. Sort of pulling ourselves up by our bootstrings and fighting for our very existence without any organization, certainly without any equipment. And really fighting just with the guts that we had at the time. We lost, in the process, 1% of our population. That's a lot of people.
But you must have anticipated there would be other conflicts, because in the 48 war you've experienced the ferocity of anti-Israeli feeling from the other Arab nations. So you must have seen other wars coming.
7 Arab armies invaded us in the War of Independence. That's how the War of Independence began. When the British pulled out, they invaded that same day. And we fought back with everything we had in order to remain alive, literally to remain alive. I mean, the alternative for facing us was to be thrown into the sea or remain alive. We hoped at the time that this would be the end of all wars because we signed armistice agreements with Jordan, Egypt, Syria and Lebanon. And every one of those armistice agreements called for a peace treaty within 6 months after the signing of the armistice agreement. So we blithely imagined that we were going to have armistice agreements. What happened, of course, was that all those involved in the war against Israel, all the leaders were assassinated. Or exiled, like King Farouk in Egypt, and his Prime Minister Nokrashi Pasha was killed, King Abdullah in Jordan, Riyad al-Sulh in Lebanon, and a series of leaders, primarily General Zaim in Syria. They were all killed. And new generations came up who were intransigent and refused time and time again, despite our outstretched hand for compromise and peace, they engaged in warfare against us. And so this went on until in a great man arose in the Middle East named Anwar Sadat realized that there was no purpose in this. And after he failed to gain a decision in the Yom Kippur War, decided that if he can't get by a military means to Jerusalem, then he'd just come straight to Jerusalem by civilian plane, which is what he did, and negotiated a peace. And we have that peace to this day, and buses leave Jerusalem and Tel Aviv every day for Cairo.
Well, of course, that treaty came about as a result of the Camp David Accord. Now, I think that accord and the treaty that was to follow was seen as a major breakthrough. It was seen as a first step on a continuing search for peace in the area.
It was a first step. A wider peace. It opened the way to peace. It changed the entire atmosphere in the Middle East, and since then we haven't moved backwards.
Have you moved forward, though?
Definitely, definitely. If you were here 12 years ago and you would ask me to forecast the situation today with the unrest that we have, if I told you the true situation, you would have said that I'm an impossible optimist. After all, look, at that time we were hermetically sealed. Today you have an open border with Egypt with a certain amount of trade, but with 120,000 Israeli tourists in Egypt this year. As I say, bus service going from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to Cairo every day, daily air services and so forth. The Israeli embassy in Cairo, which has in the meantime become again the leader of the Arab world, and been taken back into the Arab League, and still does so with the Israeli flag flying over the Israeli embassy in Cairo, an Egyptian embassy here. If you look at Jordan, the Jordan border, it's a semi-peace with over 1 million people crossing the river in both directions every year, trade crossing every day across the river, Israeli Muslims going to Mecca, crossing through Jordan, going to Mecca. Again, a situation which we never dreamt of. The Lebanese border open with thousands of Lebanese coming to work in Israel every single day. And quite a great deal of trade also. There's a lot of exports going over into the whole of Lebanon, believe it or not, via our security zone there. The only hermetically sealed border today left is that with Syria, where nothing crosses. But now, if I'd told you that this would be the situation in 12 years' time, you wouldn't have believed me, and you would have been right. But this is the situation. And those years, 12 years ago, the word Israel was not mentioned in any Arab newspaper without being put in inverted commas. They wouldn't recognize it. Today, every single Arab country talks about negotiations with Israel, about peace with Israel. Some of them want a peace that we wouldn't agree to. But the fact is that peace is not a dirty word anymore.
But Israel's still highly dependent on a great degree of military readiness, military hardware. You must preserve permanent military vigilance.
It's because of that they've all gradually come to the conclusion that there's no point in going ahead and taking the military road. That's Sadat realized. He realized that if they couldn't break us in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War with a simultaneous attack with overwhelming odds in their favor from Egypt and Syria, then the only way to achieve what he wanted to achieve, namely get back Sinai, was to come to Jerusalem and negotiate. And that's what he did, and he succeeded. And that's that message got across in the whole of the Arab world. After all, you had now an Arab Summit conference in Casablanca, in which President Mubarak talked about Security Council Resolution 242, which calls for mutual recognition for peace and negotiations for peace. You have President Mubarak accepted back and in fact being made the leader of the Arab world again, despite the fact that he honors the peace treaty with Israel and the Israeli flag flies over an Israeli embassy in Cairo. Now, all of this came about because we are strong, because we never dropped our guard. If we dropped our guard and given them a chance, obviously they would have chosen a different way. But since they realized that any other way was impracticable, that's why we've achieved this, and that's why I believe, I'm very, very optimistic that despite the problems we have now, we have problems, serious problems, we will also continue on the road to peace.
But where do you see the PLO in the whole peace equation?
Well, at the moment, I don't see it for the simple reason that the bulk of the people in Israel just don't trust them. This is a terrorist organization. It's not coherent. It's an incoherent group of terrorist organizations. Arafat doesn't really control most of them. Most of the constituent elements in the PLO are today against him. And some of them have even taken out a contract on him. I see the future with the Palestinians in the territories who've lived with us for 20, 22 years, who they don't like us, but they respect our system of government, our democracy. They've experienced our democracy. You have no idea what in effect Israeli Arab television has when they see the process of democracy in this country on the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, and in Jordan, incidentally, too. The same effect that West German television has had on East Germany. And that's also one of the reasons, in many ways, for the break with Jordan, why Jordan withdrew, because they were not prepared to go back to accept the Jordanian rule, which is a dictatorial rule. There are no parties, there's nothing there, politically speaking, and having seen our system at work. Now, I'm not saying that they've become members of the Zionist organization, that they love us, certainly not, but they respect the whole concept of democracy. So I believe that the future lies with the people here, and historically speaking, the process that went on with Algeria, where there was a split between those inside and outside, is the process that's going to develop here ultimately. It's a slow process, it takes time, but that's what's going to happen.
But what about the Geneva Declaration of December last year, when Arafat publicly renounced the use of violence and of terrorism? Is that viewed here with a certain degree of skepticism?
Very great deal of skepticism, because you judge him by his actions. And that's what we decided to do. He said he would stop terrorism. Terrorism has continued all along by constituent elements of the PLO. And he can't now come back and say, I can't control them. Then why should we talk to him? Why rely on him? Basically, when it boils down to this, that the real test, the litmus test of the intention of the PLO is whether or not they will convene the Palestine National Committee, which is their sort of parliament, and amend those sections, there are 3 of them, in the Palestine Covenant, which call for the destruction of Israel and the people of Israel. They've done it in the past. In 1968, in 1974, in 1977, they convened the Palestine National Council and amended the Palestine Covenant. Wants to be more hostile to Jordan, all sorts of decisions they had to make at that time. There's no reason, the fact that they don't do this now begs the question. And there's a large majority in Israel, about 58% in a poll, said they would favor negotiating with the PLO if they give up terror, sincerely, really. That hasn't happened. On the contrary, you see it all the time.
Do you see that Geneva Declaration is, in some sense, has been part of PLO's strategy, because it clearly has increased the international pressures, particularly American international pressure, on Israel to come to some form of accommodation?
What they've been expert at doing all along is making a statement to one audience and then turning around the next day and making a statement 180 degrees opposite to the other statement to another audience if it's suited them. Now, we're aware of this double talk, and therefore we're not taken in by it. Nor are, incidentally, the Arab countries. PLO doesn't stand very high in the eyes of the Arab countries. Arafat can't enter Syria today. He's regarded with considerable mistrust, to say the least, in Jordan and in many of the other countries. The closer people have got to them, the less they've liked them. And I'm sure that is going to be the process with the Western countries too, begun to fall over themselves and believe, because they wanted to believe, really wishful thinking, what Arafat's been saying, without asking him to prove what he's saying, to cover his checks, and that he's not doing at the moment. So I would say that in the long run, and I can already feel it. I meet regularly with the Palestinian leaders in the West Bank, in Gaza, with our own Palestinian leadership, the Israeli Arabs, and I can feel a strong change, a great desire to move forward, to have the elections in accordance with the Shamir proposal. But of course, the Palestinians are a society that lives under the reign of terror.
But you would accept that the Geneva Declaration has brought a lot of pressure to bear, American pressure to bear, on Israel to come to terms, as it were. Is there a danger that will be undue pressure, that there will be a rush towards peace, and that peace will therefore not be a valid peace?
I don't think, first of all, Israel is not the sort of country that gives in to pressure. And I don't think there will be pressure. Everybody's been talking about American pressure for the last 40 years since we've been established. There's never been any real pressure. We've got a good, close relationship with the United States. Our relationship today is very close indeed. It's based on common strategic interests. Our strategic arrangements have developed very, very considerably. The United States is behind these arrangements because it's in the interests of the United States, not only in the interests of Israel. And therefore, I think that The United States is very much aware today of the strategic value of Israel, whereas in the past there was this tendency just to be sympathetic to Israel, a fellow democracy and so forth, and consideration of the large Jewish population in the States. But today we've sort of got down to the nitty-gritty of strategic cooperation, and they're only too well aware of the value of Israel. Sixth Fleet comes in to repair its ships in Haifa. We have these facilities. We have the largest aircraft industry between Western Europe and Singapore here.
I think you'd accept that world strategy has moved quite a bit over the last number of years. Surely that affects the strategic relationship between Israel and America?
I don't think so. I don't think so. There will be a lot of give and take. There will be a lot of attempt to influence Israel. I'm quite sure of that. But in the final analysis, if they have to add up the pluses and minuses of the situation, after all the problems in the Middle East bear no relation whatsoever to the Israel-Arab conflict. If our conflict disappears for one reason or another, all the major centers of conflict and bloodshed in the Middle East will continue to exist. And you have a very major problem today in the Persian Gulf, which everybody ignores, because everybody's transfixed by our problem, because all the media are here and nowhere else. But what people don't realize abroad is, and perhaps an Irish audience would understand it better than anybody else today, the entire Palestinian population lives under the shadow of a gunman. And I'm quoting the name of Sean Casey's play. And that is a fact. People don't realize today that with all the problems we have now in the unrest, 50% of all the Palestinian casualties have been caused in the last few months have been caused by Palestinians. In other words, there's the gunman is at work. And they accuse them of collaborating with Israel. I know for a fact that a very large number of those who are killed are completely unknown to the Israeli authorities. They don't know who they are. In other words, anybody who steps out of line there today just gets a bullet in the head or might be lynched publicly, as unfortunately occurred. And one of the problems of our defense forces today is protecting Arabs against Arabs, in addition to everything else.
But I think you would recognize that there was a good deal of international complaint about the manner in which the Israeli Defense Forces dealt with the uprising in the first place. It was fairly heavy-handed.
Look, I suggest everybody looks in their own back garden before they criticize us. I haven't seen different methods used in Northern Ireland or in the inner cities in Britain, or here next door in Syria, where they just went in, Assad went in and killed 30,000 people because a few hundred were against his regime in the town of Hama, or in Algiers, where they killed 500 in 2 days. Our society wouldn't accept a solution such as the Chinese presented to the world in Tiananmen Square. We're doing our best not to cause the casualties. There are problems, and I have yet to see another society given the same problems. And remember, our alternative to having law and order is another Beirut or Tehran, with all that that implies, the most terrifying manner. So I think we're doing our best. There have been 70 courts-martial already of officers and men who have been considered, who have been accused of going beyond their authority or doing what they shouldn't have done. But it's been open. The court has been, they've been tried in open court. I don't think we've got anything really to be ashamed of. Here and there are problems. We're dealing with a society, and you have to understand what sort of society it is that sends its children to do its dirty work for it. But a mother and her 3 children who were burnt to death in a civilian bus while the mother's protecting her 3 children is no less tragically dead because the firebomb was thrown by kids. That's the horrible dilemma that we as a civilized community face, and it is a dilemma. And I talk to the troops, they face this dilemma, they talk about the dilemma, because we're a free, open society. And you'll find more criticism of what goes on in our territories, in our press, and in our Knesset, in our parliament, than you'll find anywhere else in the world. And I'm proud of the fact that this is the case.
The effect of the Intifada is to heighten suspicions and mistrusts on both sides. And in recent months, we've seen violent clashes between Arab and Israeli. Arab attacks Israeli, Israeli attacks Arab. And I think you spoke yourself not so long ago about a nation beginning perhaps to lose its values.
That's right, I did, and I took a very strong stand. And we'll be moving somewhere when there's some Arabs who speak like I spoke to the Arab leadership and speak out. Unfortunately, they're terrified to speak. They say it to me privately. They come here to this building and say it and apologize. And I got cables from them decrying what happened with the bus and so forth recently. But they won't come out openly and do it because they're afraid. And that's the problem. You have two different societies with completely different values facing each other. And, well, it's a problem we have to size up to. But let me assume that the road between Dublin and Belfast was blocked by kids throwing rocks, which can kill people, and fire bombs. What would the Garda in Ireland and the constabulary in Ulster do? And I don't think they wouldn't invite them in for a cup of coffee. They would deal with them exactly as we try to deal with them, with gas, with rubber bullets, with anything not calculated to kill. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Israel has demonstrated in 4 major conflicts with its neighbors that it is capable of defending its territory, defending its sovereignty to threats from without. But isn't the Intifada and what has happened as a result an example of the fact that it's the enemy within who's the one who's most difficult to fight, indeed impossible to fight?
I'm not sure of that. It's part of, it's a continuation of the struggle we've had all along. Let's not make any mistake about this. And the population sees it also as a struggle for our very existence. The population, we don't want to rule another people. And I've said it publicly everywhere, and we say it publicly. But this is a people that has never failed to miss an opportunity to come to peace with us. We've offered again and again to make peace. For 19 years, from 1948 till 1967, the Jordanians ruled the West Bank and the Egyptians ruled Gaza, and they didn't form a Palestinian state. There was nothing to stop them. And they didn't form a Palestinian state because then, as now, their statements to the contrary notwithstanding, they didn't want a Palestinian state, and they still don't want it. And it's only lip service when they say they do want it. They see in it a danger. It's certainly a danger for the very existence of Jordan. It's far more dangerous for Jordan than it is for Israel, and is conceived as such by King Hussein and by his government.
So when people talk about land for peace, there'd be the prospect of a homeland for the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Is that naive simply, or do people not realize that that would potentially represent a threat to the sovereignty of Israel based upon the PLO's phased plan of Cairo 81?
Here, first of all, there is the phased plan of the PLO, which people are aware of here, which is to destroy Israel in phases by reaching to agreement, advancing and then continuing. They haven't given that up. And they haven't given up the Palestine Covenant, which calls for the destruction of Israel. Here you're entering into an area of political disagreement in Israel. And this prevents me from taking a side in this matter. But what you have here today is 2 major blocks in the country. One block which both are against a Palestinian state. Both are members of the government today, which is against the creation of a Palestinian state. There are elements in the Labour Party who do favour a Palestinian state. There are elements to the left of the Labour Party. Nearly all the elements are in favour of a Palestinian state. On the right, that is from the Likud to the right, the Likud are willing to give the Arabs home rule, local autonomy, with everything except foreign affairs and defense. There may be a debate within the Likud if they're willing to give them any more in the course of negotiations. To the right, certainly they will not be willing to give them any more. That's the debate in Israeli society. There is a debate too in Palestinian society, but it doesn't get public expression because leaders are afraid to speak out against the official PLO line, because whenever they've done so, they just end up with a bullet in their neck.
You've talked about the internal politics and how some favor land for peace, some favor negotiation and so on. But why is it that no one seems to favor an international peace conference?
Because it'll bring nothing. What's the purpose of an international peace conference? The most obvious thing is a conference between us and the Arabs and the Palestinians. What do we need to talk to China about in order to achieve any move forward? China doesn't recognize us. We have no diplomatic relations with China. We have no diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. There'll be 2 out of the 3 international groups that will be chairing or running this peace conference. What do we need them for? What advantage would we get out of it?
But Israel has got very close links with the United States of America. Syria, very close links with the Soviet Union. There is superpower interest, there is superpower involvement in the area, so therefore surely there's got to be superpower input.
There is superpower involvement in the negotiation that we had with Egypt. They would never have succeeded without the direct involvement of the United States government, the President of the United States and the United States government at that time. The Soviet Union has, as it were, spoken itself out of the arena because it has no relations with Israel. We've made it clear it has no standing here until it has relations with both sides. So I honestly really don't see any purpose in an international conference which can do nothing. All it can ultimately do is say both sides should sit down and negotiate. Well, that's so obvious we should be doing it. We should have been doing it years ago. We've been saying that all along.
So how do you see meaningful negotiations taking place? Do you see it being done, for example, on a state-by-state basis, negotiations with Jordan, negotiations with Iraq, negotiations with Syria, negotiations with Lebanon?
Well, the main issues at the moment, first of all, the Palestinians. We have to negotiate. And we've said to the Palestinians living with us in the territories, elect your leaders and let's enter negotiations. It's as simple as that. That's the plan, Shamir's plan. There's a debate who will be what people will have franchise in order to elect, who can stand and so forth. But in principle we're saying elect your representatives, let's enter negotiations. First thing, you get home rule and you run yourself for 5 years. And on the 3rd year we'll begin to negotiate what the final arrangement is. That's what we've proposed. That proposal stands open now. And there are now all sorts of internal problems in Israel as well, and also amongst the Palestinians. Then the other country, the main country we have to negotiate with, and we can't do anything without them, that's with Jordan. We have a very long border with Jordan. We have much common interest with Jordan. There's much coming and going today with Jordan. There's a great deal of common business between us and Jordan today. So Jordan is obviously the next country. If Lebanon ever has a government, which it doesn't have today, it's a sorry mess, it's chaos, a morass, then we'll have to talk to Lebanon as well. But at the moment there's nobody to talk to, they're just killing each other, busy killing each other all the time. And then ultimately we will have to talk to Syria as well. At least we must finish with all the countries, conclude our negotiation, all the countries that border on us. The rest will fall into line, I'm sure.
We've talked about relationships between countries, or often the lack of those relationships. But what about relationships between people? When we see on our television screens or on our newspapers, Jew attack Arab, Arab attack Jew with a considerable degree of venom. When you see that, surely you must realize there's the sheer difficulty of bringing people together in this region in some kind of peaceful coexistence.
Well, you're presenting a picture which is unfortunately being presented abroad of black and white. 2 black lines, Israelis on one side, Arabs on the other, everybody killing each other. And you know as well as I know, if you've been here, you're in a city with 100,000 Arabs, this capital city, in which I take a walk in the streets. And there's no other head of state in the world certainly not in the Middle East, who take to walk in the streets with an Arab population. We live together, we trade together. People don't realize that we have almost 750,000 Arabs and Druze in Israel who are citizens of Israel, who vote, who sit in parliament, who are voted in municipal elections. People don't realize abroad that we have Arabs, that is Bedouin, and Druze serving in our military forces, that we have one Druze general, we have 6 Druze brigade commanders commanding Israeli troops. The picture, there are cases, yes, of Arabs beating up Jews and Jews beating up Arabs, just the same as you have probably in Northern Ireland, of Catholics beating up Protestants, Protestants beating up Catholics, but the bulk of Northern Ireland are living together. And what the media has done to us, as they did for Ireland, incidentally, is to turn the whole of Israel into Falls Road, into an Israeli Falls Road. And just the same as Falls Road doesn't apply to the whole of Northern Ireland, or certainly not the whole of Ireland, so this picture doesn't apply here. It exists, it's there, but within a certain perspective, and not for everybody to see everywhere in the country. The country lives normally with a large Arab population.